Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. In this lesson we'll be talking about one last instrument procedure you may encounter on instrument arrivals, approaches, and departures, the DME Arc. We'll talk about what they are, how they're used, how to fly them, and then demonstrate how to fly them using different types of avionics. As always, if you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video, share with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell to be alerted to new content. Before we start this lesson, it's a good idea to be familiar with the basics of instrument flying as well as the basics of flying instrument approaches. You should also be familiar with the basics of VOR navigation as well as the basics of using distance measuring equipment or DME. We'll be flying this procedure using both the analog or steam gauge Cessna 172 Classic as well as the Garmin G1000 equipped Cessna 172. The Cessna 172 Classic is equipped with a Garmin GNS 530 and 430, so if you're not familiar with how to operate those or the G1000, you might want to catch up on that as well. I'll leave links to all those videos, plus a link to the entire instrument training playlist in this video's description. So what is a DME Arc? A DME arc is an instrument procedure in which the pilot flies a curved flight path to maintain a constant DME distance from a nav aid. Typically, this nav aid is a VOR DME or VORTAC, though in theory it could also be an NDB DME. DME arcs are most commonly used as initial approach segments that allow a pilot to transition from the en route environment to the intermediate or final approach segments of an instrument approach, though they can also be used in terminal procedures such as obstacle DPs, SIDS, and STARS. They are depicted on instrument approach charts as curved approach segments. They will typically start at an initial approach fix and terminate when they curve onto the intermediate or final approach segment, typically intercepting the final approach course. Most are marked with lead radials that let a pilot know when they should start to turn to intercept the final approach course. Since they are segments of the approach, they will have a procedure altitude and procedure notes on them. They will also have information noted about the nav aid you maintain your DME distance from, the DME distance to be maintained, and be identified as a DME arc. They will not have any sort of course information on them since you are not maintaining a constant course during the procedure. The radials leading out to the initial approach fixes where the arcs start are not usually identified as navigable routes such as feeder routes on the approach charts, though they are often Victor airways you can find on the low in route chart. So looking at an example, here is the ILS or localizer to runway 18 at Pine Bluff, Grider Field. The identifier on that field is Kilo Papa Bravo Foxtrot. And you can see we have two DME arcs, one on the west side of the field and one on the east side of the field. And again, we have a radial that leads out to it. Again, if you look on the chart, this is actually a Victor airway we can fly. But it is not identified as such on the chart, but we could actually take this route out to the initial approach fix. The initial approach fix is where it starts. Again, it's a segment of the approach, so you have a procedure altitude there, 2,000 feet. If you're cleared for the approach, is what you can go down to while you are flying the arc. It does tell you that you do not have to do the procedure turn. It says no PT. Identifies this as the Pine Bluff VOR is what you do the distance from, and it is the 8 DME arc, and that it denotes that it is an arc. And then up here we have the lead radial. It says LR. That stands for lead radial. So we know when we cross this radial, it's time to turn in to intercept the localizer course to fly this ILS approach. How you fly a DME arc depends on how your aircraft is equipped. With all aircraft, you want to track out to the fix where the DME arc begins and turn to a heading that's 90 degrees from the heading of the radial that identifies the fix. For example, here, the 128 degree radial identifies the initial approach fix where this arc begins. So we want to turn 20 degrees to the left, which would be 20 degrees down in terms of numbers. So 128 minus 90 degrees is going to equal an initial heading of about 038 as we start to fly the arc. You want to lead the turn by about a half a percentage of your ground speed so you don't overshoot the distance you're trying to maintain. For example, if you have a ground speed of 100 knots, 100 times 0.005 equals zero point 0.5. So you want to start your turn onto the arc 0.5 nautical miles before you reach the arc. So if we're coming from this direction here, flying away from the VOR, when we get to 7.5 DME, we want to start that turn from 128 out to 038. If we're coming this direction and we're flying towards the VOR, we want to start it at about 8.5 since we'll be beyond 8 as we're tracking inbound towards the arc. If you're flying a DME arc with an analog panel that has traditional VOR indicators, then you want to use the technique of turn 10, twist 10. You'll maintain your initial heading, in this particular example, of 038, and you'll twist your OBS 10 degrees down to the next radial that's up to the north that's 10 degrees lower, so the 118 degree radial. And when that radial centers up on your CDI, then you want to turn 10 degrees to the left. So we started on a heading of 038. We'll then turn to a heading of 028. We'll then twist the OBS 10 more degrees to the left. So that would be the 108 degree radial. And then once we get the CDI centered up on that 108 degree radial, we'll turn 10 more degrees left. So we'll now be taking up a heading of 018. We'll repeat this process until we get up to the lead radial, in this case the 008 degree radial, and once we cross that radial, then we know it's time to go ahead and make a turn to intercept the localizer course. If you drift inside of the arc, so if you go under 8 DME, then all you really need to do is hold your heading. You can see if you're on this particular heading, you're actually flying in this direction, so you're going to be flying away from the arc. So if you get to 7.9, 7.8 DME, just hold your present heading and allow the aircraft to kind of drift back out onto the arc. If you are outside of the arc, if your distance is greater than what you're supposed to be maintaining, then you kind of have two options there. You can either turn early, so make your 10-degree turn before you get to the next radial, or you can turn a little bit more. You can turn, say, 15 or 20 degrees to get that DME centered back up where you want it, and then resume your normal turn 10, twist 10 maneuver. You also want to take into consideration wind. If you've got a strong crosswind, you're going to need a little bit of correction. And remember that on an arc, since it's a constantly changing course, if you have, say, a direct crosswind coming this direction, when you first start the arc, that is eventually going to wind up being a little bit of a headwind as you get over towards the lead radial, not as much of a crosswind. So you'll have to change the correction as you work your way around the arc. The smaller the arc is, the quicker you're going to move along that arc. The circumference is going to be smaller, so you will pass through those cross radials quite a bit more quickly than you would on a larger circumference. So for example, Pine Bluff's 8 DME arc is a pretty tight arc, and you'll notice as soon as we twist to the next 10-degree radial, we're going to center up on that radial fairly quickly. So flying around the arc is not going to take a whole lot of time. We're going to hit each radial pretty quickly in succession, versus if we were flying something like the 10 DME arc here in Fort Smith, you're going to go through those radials a little bit more slowly. And on a radial or a DME arc like the 15 DME arc out here in Helena, Montana, you're going to go through those even more slowly. Although, of course, it does depend on your altitude, your true airspeed, and wind conditions, and your ground speed. But generally speaking, the larger the arc, the slower you're going to make your way between the cross radials on that arc. It's also worth noting that air traffic control in real life can vector you onto any point on the arc. So if they wanted to, say, vector you, if you're coming in from this direction and they want to vector you onto the arc here, they can do that. All you do is dial up the radial that you're currently on, and then turn it 90 degrees from that radial once you get established or once you get within your lead distance of the arc, and then you just do the normal technique until you get around to the lead radial. If you're flying the Arc with an aircraft equipped with a bearing pointer for your VOR, this makes things a little simpler. You still enter the Arc the same way, but once you're established, you can just make occasional small turns to keep the bearing pointer on your wingtip, plus or minus any wind correction. If you don't want to make a lot of turns, you can just let the bearing pointer fall 10 degrees before making each turn. Thus, the turn 10, twist 10 technique becomes the turn 10, fall 10 technique. Of course, if you want to fly a DME Arc on easy mode, you can just load it up in your GPS. All you need to do to fly the DME Arc using a GPS is to load the approach the Arc is associated with, and then load the fix where the Arc begins as your entry fix. While you should still monitor the DME as you fly the Arc, the GPS will automatically fly a perfect Arc for you right onto the final approach course. All right, so we're sitting on the ramp here in Pine Bluff. Let's take a look real quick at how to load up a DME Arc using the G1000, and the same technique would be used for most GPSs. So we'll go to Procedures, we'll go to Select Approach, and then we'll put in Pine Bluff, since that is the approach that we want to load is located there. So KPBF, we'll hit Enter, and we want the ILS to 1.8, and then it asks us where do you want to start that approach. So we'll scroll down to ITEL, which is the fix at which the DME Arc begins. And you can see it draws ITEL, it draws the Arc over to Raylo, and then it draws the rest of the approach in there. So we'll hit Enter, and then we'll scroll down. We don't need to put our minimums in since we're not actually going to go flying. And then we will hit Activate, and it reminds you that this is not approved. GPS guidance is for monitoring and positional awareness only. You should not use it as primary navigation, so you should still put your DME up here to make sure that this is accurate. But you can couple it with the autopilot. So we'll go ahead and acknowledge that. And you can see it draws everything in there. We'll go ahead and go to flight plan, and you can see it zoomed in big here. We're going direct to ITEL intersection, and then it'll do the DME Arc, and then it will turn us on to the approach course. So that's how you load it up. Another trick that you can use is, say if you're getting vectored in and you need to join the Arc somewhere other than ITEL, what you can do is steer yourself onto this portion of the Arc manually, and just basically use the heading mode to put yourself on this Arc, and then go to flight plan, and then go down to Raylo intersection here, and go to menu, and then go to activate leg and hit enter. It'll ask, do you want to activate ITEL to Raylo? And we will say activate, and you notice this now turns that magenta. So if you're getting vectored on somewhere besides the starting point, again, you just use your heading mode to get yourself on there, then activate that leg, then you can engage the nav mode, and you can join the Arc at any point that you'd like to join it. So to demonstrate flying a DME Arc, let's make a quick IFR flight between Sheridan Grant County Regional Airport in Sheridan, Arkansas. The identifier for that airport is 9 Mike 8, and Pine Bluff Regional Airport in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. The identifier on that field is Kilo Papa Bravo Foxtrot. We'll plan to fly direct to Pine Bluff VOR DME, then take Victor 74 to ITEL intersection, where we can fly the 8-mile DME Arc onto the ILS to runway 17 at Pine Bluff. I won't actually demonstrate flying the ILS approach since we've already covered ILS approaches, but you're welcome to continue the approach to a landing from the DME Arc if you'd like. Our filed route will be Sheridan Airport direct to Pine Bluff VOR DME, then taking Victor 74 to ITEL intersection, and then direct to Pine Bluff Airport. Again, we'll fly the DME Arc, and we'd probably want to put a remark in the flight plan to let ATC know that we want to fly that Eastern DME Arc onto the ILS approach, or we could just let them know that once we get airborne. We'll file for an altitude of 3,300 feet, which is not a normal IFR altitude, but it keeps us at the MSA for the approach. It says when we're within 25 nautical miles of Pine Bluff, 3,300 feet will keep us at a legal obstacle clearance height. And I don't want to go all the way up to 5,000, and we will be within 25 nautical miles of Pine Bluff VOR DME when we launch off of Sheridan. The flight with the arc and the approach is about 60 nautical miles in length, and that should take us about 30 minutes to fly in the Cessna 172. We'll plan to depart runway 19 at Sheridan, and that will require a back taxi if you start on the ramp. We've checked the departure procedures there, and there is an obstacle departure procedure that has us flying a heading of 192, which is runway heading, to 800 feet on our altimeter before turning to the north. We'll assume that the weather in Sheridan is good enough to get back in there on one of the RNAV approaches and that we feel comfortable departing. Current reported weather at Pine Bluff is calm winds, 3/4 mile statute mile visibility in mist, overcast ceiling 300 feet, temperature 23, dew point 23, altimeter 2992, with a forecast for it to remain the same for the next few hours. We'll assume that we have filed an alternate for the flight and that it is a legal alternate. So we'll take off from Sheridan Airport. We'll be heading southbound. We'll get up to 800 feet and we'll make the left turn direct to Pine Bluff VOR DME and climb up to 3,300 feet. And once we cross over the Pine Bluff VOR DME, we get the flip from the to the from. We'll dial in that 128 degree radial, and we will track that out. That puts us on Victor 74. We do have a MEA of 2,000 feet on Victor 74, so we will probably assume that we're going to get clearance down to 2,000 feet once we cross the VOR. And we'll go ahead and head down to 2,000 feet, and we'll assume we get clearance for the approach shortly after that. Again, ITEL is 8 DME, and that's the arc. And again, we want to lead that turn. So assume we get approach clearance. And then when we get to 7.5 DME, since we're flying away from the VOR, we'll make that turn to that 028 degree heading. And once we have established ourselves on that, sorry, it's a 038 degree heading. Once we establish ourselves on that 038 degree heading, we'll go ahead and tune up the 118 degree radial, and we'll fly until we get that CDI centered up on that radial. Then we'll turn another 10 degrees to the left, and then we'll dial up the 108 degree radial, and then we'll continue that procedure all the way until we get to the lead radial of 008. And then just make sure to make your corrections as you're needed. If you start getting, on the inside of the arc, your DME goes under 8, then just hold your heading or make a little turn to the right and get it back out to 8 DME. And if you're going outside, then maybe turn a little bit early or maybe turn 15 or 20 degrees instead of just 10 degrees to get back on the arc in the direction to the east there. We do have a procedure altitude of 2,000 feet. It says no procedure turn. We'll already be at 2,000 feet. And then once we hit the lead radial of 008, we will dial in the localizer on 111.7. And in theory, the way the lead radial is supposed to work is you hit the lead radial and then you make a standard rate turn onto this course. And by the time you turn on to 178, you should be on the localizer course. That does not typically work out well for slower aircraft like the 172. So what we'll do is we'll hit the lead radial, we'll dial up the localizer, and we'll turn to an intercept heading. So probably about 40 degrees of intercept on the heading. So that would be about a 220 heading or so. And then just fly that intercept heading until we intercept the localizer. And then I will probably just stay at 2,000 feet. It is legal to stay. It's at or above altitude there. I probably will not go down to 1,900 feet. I'll just stay at 2,000 feet and intercept the glide slope from 2,000 feet. All right, so we'll set up for the flight from the world map. We'll start at the top left and work our way over to the right and then down to the bottom. So for the aircraft, we'll select the Textron Aviation Cessna 172 Skyhawk. You do not want the 172 G1000 edition for this first flight, and again, this is available only in the deluxe edition. So you would have to choose a different aircraft with traditional VOR setup if you want to try this with traditional VORs. Liveries, you can do whatever you'd like to with that. With weight and balance, I'm going to go ahead and give us 2 full tanks of gas. And 2 170-pound passengers. We won't do anything with failures and customization. You can do whatever you'd like to do with that. For the departure, I will go ahead and select departure and then put in 9 Mike 8, which is Sheridan Municipal. We'll click on that. That'll zoom us in. And I'm going to start over here at the ramp. But you could start at runway 19 if you'd like to, and note that if you don't start on the runway, you will have to back taxi to get to the end of runway 19. As far as flight conditions, we will set a mid-June day, and then we'll close out of here, and we'll set the time for about noon for lighting conditions, both the time and the date for lighting conditions, and then we'll set the weather up in the actual sim session. So we are ready to go fly. So as far as the weather setup goes, we will set the altitude calculation to AMSL, so we don't get any sloping cloud bases. We don't need to worry about the top 2 layers of clouds, but the bottom layer I set coverage at 100%, density at 0.75. This is all setting up for that ILS into Pine Bluff if you want to fly that. And that should give you about 3/4 mile visibility. Scatter, it doesn't matter what you do with that. I have it set to 0. I put the tops up around 10,000 and the bottoms at -500, which is 1,000 feet under the minimums for the approach. That should give you breaking out around 200 to 300 feet if you choose to shoot the approach. As far as the rest of the settings, I have precipitation set in 0. You could probably put a little in there if you wanted just some for effect. No snow depth, no lightning, temperature about 75 degrees, altimeter is standard 2992, and the humidity is set to 1, and you don't really want it any higher than that because it will affect your visibility. Although all that being said, if you're just flying the Arc and not flying the approach, it doesn't really matter what you set as long as you put yourself in the clouds. Okay, as far as the avionics setup goes, we've got the aircraft started up and the avionics booted up, and the GNS 530 and 430 have done their initialization. And so what I'm going to do is I've put Pine Bluff VOR up here in the active for number 1, and then I put it into the VLOC mode, so we are receiving a VOR indication up here. You can see we're not receiving anything right now here on the ground, although we are getting the DME, which I don't think you would actually be able to do in real life. But as soon as we get airborne, we should get the signal pretty quickly and be able to navigate to the VOR. I've got the ILS frequency for the ILS into Pine Bluff standing by on number 1, and then I put number 2 also on the Pine Bluff VOR just to have another source of data there. And again, we've got the DME distance displayed up here, so that's what we'll use to shoot the Arc, and really didn't need anything to stand by for number 2. I put the GNS 530 on the traffic screen just so I don't have any data I can cheat with as far as a moving map or anything like that. And then I've got it on nav page 1 for the GNS 430. So we'll get the cross track and ground speed, but we won't really get anything else from that. So again, we're not cheating by using GPS data. Other things I've done, I've set the autopilot up to 3,300 feet on the altitude pre-select, so the altitude we're likely to be cleared to, and then I've got the heading bug set to 192, which is our runway heading here in Sheridan. So that should be everything set up for the flying the DME Arc. So now we'll go ahead and call and get our IFR clearance. So really the only way to get our clearance on the ground at Sheridan is to call Little Rock Approach Control on the phone, which you can find at the airport facility director. So we call them up, we tell them we're on the ramp at Sheridan, ready to pick up IFR clearance to Pine Bluff. They call back and they say Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, cleared to Pine Bluff Airport as filed, enter controlled airspace heading 192, climb and maintain 3,300, squawk 5502. We read all that back. They likely give us a hold for release, or they may give us a clearance void time. So we will go ahead and taxi out, do our run up, and then call them for the IFR release. Once we backtaxi to the small run-up area at the end of runway 19, we'll perform our run-up and then give Little Rock approach a call for our IFR release. Once we receive our release, we'll accomplish our before takeoff checklist and then perform a normal takeoff from runway 19. Once airborne, we'll check in with Little Rock approach. They call us back and say Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, radar contact. Climb and maintain 3,300. Proceed direct to Pine Bluff VOR. Resume own navigation. We'll turn left direct to the VOR and engage the nav tracking mode on the autopilot. Once we cross the Pine Bluff VOR, we'll intercept the 128-degree radial outbound to join Victor 74. We'll assume Little Rock approach gives us clearance down to 2,000 feet at this time. Once level at 2,000, Little Rock approach calls and says Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, maintain 2,000 until established on the approach, cleared for the ILS 18 at Pine Bluff. This clears us to join the DME Arc on the approach. All right, so we've leveled at 2,000 and we are coming up on 7.4. 7.5 is where we want to make our turn. There it is. So we'll go ahead and turn to that heading of 038, and it's turn initially 90 and twist 10. So we'll go ahead and twist this to the 118. There's 120, 119, 118. And as soon as this comes across, then it's time to turn another 10 degrees. You can see we're right on 8 DME right now. We're on the 038 degree heading. And another little trick you can use is when this centers up, you can look to the left and this will tell you what heading you need to be on for your next heading on the left side of the OBS here. So we've got 038 in there. Our next heading is going to be 038. So we'll get to that point, wait till it centers up, and then we'll go ahead and turn to that 038 heading. We'll keep an eye on our DME and then make corrections left or right from there to keep it within 1 nautical mile and try to give yourself, a little less tolerance than that. Okay, so there's the crossing. We're a little bit outside the arc right now, so I'm going to turn to 038. I'm going to do a little bit more to try to get us back inside the arc there, and then I'll twist 10. So there is 110, 109, 108, and when it comes through and centers up again, then I go to a heading of about 018 plus or minus whatever I need to try to keep it at 8 DME. And I could probably even turn a little bit early since I'm still outside. I can go ahead to that 018 degree heading right now. And we'll see if that can get us back inside. And then there's that centered up. I've already done my turn, so I'll turn it to 098 degree radial and continue this process all the way around until we get to that 008 degree radial. Then we'll make that turn and intercept the localizer course. Still a little bit outside, so I'm going to go ahead and make my turn early again, see if that'll get me inside. And I might actually add a few extra degrees onto that turn. All right, so they're crossing through the 018 degree radial. I'm dialing in the 008 degree radial. So when we cross this radial, we need to go ahead and make our turn inbound to intercept the localizer course. You can see we're still staying on 8 DME, so everything is looking there. We're just waiting for this to center up, and we'll go ahead and take up that roughly 220 heading to intercept the localizer course. You'll notice I also have the lead radial down here, so I can kind of monitor that when I flip over to the localizer as well. So there it comes, centering up there. All right, so I'll go ahead and take up a heading of about 220. That'll be a good intercept heading. And I'll go ahead and flip the localizer in there. So there's 220. 111.7 is up. I can go ahead and dial my inbound course in here. Of course, it doesn't matter with the localizer, but it's a reminder of what my inbound course is. And now I just need to monitor and look for the intercept. There's 178 there. Again, really doesn't matter what I put in here with the localizer up there. Right, so the localizer is coming alive. Once it centers up, I'll go over to that heading of 178 and go ahead and engage the nav mode. And then all we need to do, since we're cleared for the approach, is intercept the glide slope and fly it on in. So that is how you fly a DME Arc using traditional nav aids, and that's how you do it to an ILS approach. Go ahead and arm the approach mode. Approach is active and glide slope is armed, and we are good to go for the approach. Okay, so now let's take a quick look at what this is going to look like on an HSI or an RMI, something where you have a bearing pointer. So to take a look at how I would set this up on the G1000, you can see that I have my DME up there. I currently am in an active pause mode, and I'm tracking with the HSI outbound on Victor 74. About 7 miles away, and so what's going to happen is when I get to about 7.5 miles, about half a mile prior, I'll go ahead and turn to this 038 heading, and then I can just watch the bearing pointer, and I can either do continuous small turns to keep the bearing pointer in the same place, or I can do turn 10 and then let the bearing pointer head fall or the tail rise 10, so I can do it that way. You'll notice if you watch the GPS fly it that it's making continuous small turns, about 1 degree every 2 to 3 to 4 seconds or something like that. So you can do it that way and just try to keep the bearing pointer not quite on the wing. It's usually just a little bit behind the wing for the head and just a little bit above the wing for the tail. Or you can, like I said, let it fall or rise 10 degrees and then turn 10 degrees and do it just like you were doing with the old-fashioned VOR indicator. So let's take a look at what that looks like. All right, so there's 7.5. I'm going to go ahead and put it in that heading mode and turn over to 038. And you'll notice that the HSI at that point, or the bearing pointer at that point, is going to be on my wing. And then I just want to let the tail rise up to 118 over here, and then I know it's time to turn again, or I can just, as the tail falls, I can continue to try to keep it in the same place. So I'm a little bit outside of the arc here. I'll probably go ahead and start my turn. Maybe it's just try to keep the bearing pointer on the wing for right now and see if that brings it back in. I could also use the HSI needle and center it up just like I did with the old-fashioned VOR technique. So for right now, I'm just going to try to keep the bearing pointer on the wing. As the head falls and the tail rises, I'm just going to make small turns to try to keep it on the wing. So you notice it's falling just a little bit behind the wing now, so I'll make just a little bit of a small turn to keep it on the wingtip. And if I start to get outside, what I can do is I can put the bearing pointer just a little bit in front of the wingtip, and that should bring me back into the arc, should bring me back towards the VOR. And so I'll just put in maybe a 5 degrees, so where it's 5 degrees above the wing, and it's going to continuously fall. The head's going to fall and the tail's going to rise as I continue to fly this arc. So now I've got it right at 8 miles. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold the heading for now, and I'm going to let the bearing pointer fall probably about 10 degrees before I make another turn. So that's the basic technique that you can use for flying it with an HSI. Again, you can use the HS or the CDI here, and you can dial in the radial, but you can just take a look at the bearing pointer and just try to keep it basically on your wing plus or minus a little bit. So as far as the certification standards, when you can consider yourself proficient at being able to fly DME arcs, that's covered in the Airman Certification Standards for the instrument rating airplane. It is Area of Operations 5, Navigation System, Task A, Intercepting and Tracking Navigational Systems and Arcs. As you're flying the arc, they expect you to be able to maintain your airspeed plus or minus 10 knots and your altitude plus or minus 100 feet. And maintain your DME distance on the arc plus or minus 1 nautical mile. So you're given a mile either side of the stated distance on the arc for the maneuver to be considered acceptable. That concludes this video. Hopefully it's given you the knowledge and skills you need to fly DME arcs in Microsoft Flight Simulator on your own. Again, if you've enjoyed the content, don't forget to like the video, share with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell to be alerted to new content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.